Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, and welcome back here to our Unit 1 Learning Outcome 7. Today, we are going to be talking about how feeding and fasting are going to affect our metabolic pathways. So, we're going to look at that along with how exercise intensity and exercise duration also affect our metabolic pathways. So, let's go ahead and get right into it here. Now, whenever you are eating an excessive amount of macronutrients, your body stores them or uses them in a few different ways. The easiest one, and granted it's not in order here, are fats. Because when you eat fats and you eat an excessive amount of fats, your body very easily stores them as more fat. You have an unlimited capacity to store fats. So that's never an issue. If you try to have too many proteins, your body cannot store them. We don't hold on to proteins the same way we hold on to fats or the same way we hold on to carbs. Your body just can't hold on to them. You don't have the ability to store proteins for later use. You use it or you lose it. If you eat too much protein, you're going to get some of that protein converted into free fatty acids and triglycerides. First, your body's going to try to use as much as it can. So it can only use a small amount for protein synthesis or to synthesize more muscle. If you still have more protein, your body's going to use it for ATP production. So you're going to go through the process of deaminating, amino acids. Those get converted to your fatty acids, your triglycerides. If you still have stuff left over, that then will get stored as adipose tissue. In general, the most amount of proteins you can get in a day are really pushing the limit of the average American diet. Meaning, unless you're going to be a bodybuilder or say like a power lifter, you rarely, if ever, need to take a protein supplement. Your normal diet will give you all the protein you need for all of the protein synthesis and tissue repair you need. Now, when we get into carbs, carbs do get stored, and they get stored as glycogen. Glycogen is stored in two different places. It's stored in your liver or it's stored in your muscle. If it's stored in your muscle, it gets converted into ATP. So muscle glycogen goes through a process where it converts to GLUT6 phosphate, and from there it goes into glycolysis and it gives us ATP, and that's from your muscle because our muscles need energy immediately. So your body stores glycogen right at the point where you would need to use it. This is like saying you have a car and your gasoline is stored in the gas tank located in your car. You have your fuel you need for future use located right there. You don't have to do anything to get it because it's right there with the car. If you had to go and pick up gas constantly just to keep your car going, it'd be really inefficient. Now, the other place you have it, where you have glycogen, is in your liver. We don't use the glycogen in our liver for ATP production proper. We use this for blood glucose regulation. So when you release glycogen from the liver, it is because your blood glucose levels are too low and you need to get them up. So what happens is you have your pancreas, and we'll talk about this when we get into the endocrine system, and it releases glucagon. Glucagon signals your liver that your blood glucose is too low. So your liver releases glycogen to then turn into blood glucose. On the other hand, if your blood glucose levels were too low, then your pancreas, instead of releasing glucagon, is going to release insulin. And we'll see how that plays into it in the next slide here. Actually, I believe in 2 slides. So, glycogen is stored. You're only storing roughly 400 grams of carbs. And that's for an approximately 150-pound man. So really, you're only storing a little over 2,000 calories worth of carbs. Conversely, if we take fat storage, and let's say you weigh 200 pounds and you have 10% body fat, that means that you have 20 pounds of fat. And that means that you have 20 times 3,500, because there's 3,500 calories in a pound. That equals 70,000 calories of fat storage versus about 2,000 of carbs. Now, if you can consume too many carbs, so let's say that you consume too much that your body can't store them as glycogen, now your body will convert those into fatty acids and triglycerides, similar to how it would work with proteins. Now, the only problem with this is that it takes a lot to do that. So it costs your body a lot of energy in lost ATP to be able to do that. What is somewhat good, or the kind of the silver lining with an excessive amount of carb consumption, is that carbs are considered protein sparing macronutrients. What this means is that when your body has the choice between using carbs and using proteins for ATP, it will always take carbs when they're available. When you spare proteins, that means you can use proteins for what their primary function is, and that, again, is tissue repair. You do not want to use proteins for ATP. You want to use carbs and you want to use fats for ATP production. Now, let's take a look at what's going to happen when we're fasting. When you're fasting means you're not eating. So this here shows how or what happens when we fast. After your body has used all of the calories it can from a meal you consume, it goes and uses your energy stores for ATP. So it'll start using glycogen and it'll start using fat stores, which is great. That's exactly what you want your body to do. So you go from glycogen to glucose to energy, or ATP, body fat to fatty acids to ATP. Super easy, barely an inconvenience. Now, what happens if we take that to the next level? let's go past our available glycogen. Remember, with glycogen, you only have about 2,000 calories. After that's gone, so let's say that's all gone, now we go to here. So if you take about a full day, 24 hours, and you don't eat anything, now what your body goes through is a shutdown mode, because your body starts getting into a starvation mode. This is really, really bad, because now if you no longer have glycogen, your body gets really worried that it's not going to be getting any more calories. So what it does is it shuts down your most metabolically active body parts. That is protein. So your muscle and lean tissue become the first casualties of self-starvation. So whether it's intentional or not, if you're not eating regularly, your body will start breaking down proteins and start taking amino acids, so deaminating amino acids, to eventually turn to glucose, to ATP. The reason it does this is because you have to feed your brain. Your brain, while it can run on ketone bodies, and we'll touch on that here next, it has to have a certain percentage of glucose to make itself run. This means that if you don't have glucose, your brain does not work. At best, your brain can operate on about 2/3 ketones and about 1/3 glucose. It still needs, at its absolute limit, about 1/3 of its total energy production to be from, or its energy consumption to be from glucose or carbs. Now, some research has suggested that we can stretch that even farther, but the ethics on testing whether or not someone can be starved and see how their brain still functions is a little bit iffy. So I don't think we're going to be testing that theory, or I shouldn't say theory, that hypothesis, anytime soon. Now, what happens here is that we will then start using body fat to convert into ketones. When your body goes into starvation mode, it holds on to body fat. Your body fat is like your savings account. You don't spend your savings account unless you don't have any money anywhere else. Your savings account is meant to save, not to spend. You spend your checking account, you spend your slush fund. You don't spend your savings account. So your body fat's your savings account. When your checking account runs out, your checking account meaning your glycogen levels, your body says, I need to make sure I don't lose any of my money in my savings account. So what it does is it goes and it takes your protein, which costs you the most amount of money, or in this case, the most amount of calories, and it says, I'm going to quit spending. So when you quit spending, you break it down. So now I'm going to use my proteins for ATP because I need to save my savings or my body fat. Eventually, your body's going to get out of this and it's going to start using more body fat to produce ketones. When you get into a state of ketosis, you have ultra low levels of carbohydrates, and low levels of carbohydrates mean you're consuming under 50 grams of carbs per day. So that means you are under 200 calories of carbs per day. When you're under this amount, you go into this state of ketosis where your body forms ketone bodies. Ketone bodies are not quite fats, They're not quite carbs, but they can be used similarly the way we would use carbs. Now, a practical example of what ketones are is like acetone or nail polish remover. Your body actually produces that. Now, when we look at having an ultra low calorie diet and producing ketones, one of the things that you'll see happen is many people now have been using a ketogenic diet. A ketogenic diet means that you have a high amount of fats, a normal amount of proteins, and a very low amount of carbs. When you go on a ketogenic diet, the thought is that I will get my body to use fats as a primary fuel source, and I will no longer have to use carbs as a primary fuel source. Ultimately, the goal is to lose body fat. Now, is this sustainable or not? Well, this is a very difficult thing to do. Something like this should never be done by someone that has type 1 diabetes. However, this is indicated in children that have epilepsy and people that have type 2 diabetes. So those are the two medical conditions that a ketogenic diet is indicated. Now, I spoke about mitochondrial disorders previously, and ketogenic diets have shown some viability with helping as a almost prophylactic treatment for mitochondrial disorders, because it can help offset some of the lactic acidosis that occurs in many mitochondrial disorders, thereby lowering instances of epileptic type seizures. Now, if you're using a ketogenic diet for just your day-to-day life, the worst thing you can do is to do a ketogenic diet for about a week or two and then quit. The first 2 weeks, if you read the literature or even any anecdotal stories, are usually the toughest. The reason being is because this is the time your body is primarily using proteins to convert into ATP or to glucose. If you were to quit during that time, you would lose weight, but almost 90% of the weight you would lose in that first couple weeks is from fat-free mass or your muscle mass, which is very bad. You never want to lose that. So if you do a ketogenic diet, you need to be thinking long-term. This needs to be something you do for many months, possibly years, if you want to see the full physiological benefits out of it. Now, when you produce ketones, you have to have oxygen. You cannot use, you have to use oxygen when you have ketone productions. That means your activity level or your sports performance level for anaerobic activity is going to be compromised. You're not going to be a sprinting athlete on a ketogenic diet. You are going to have less explosiveness, more endurance. A possible good research project would be to see how a ketogenic diet would work on endurance athletes or ultra endurance athletes. But in terms of anaerobic activity, ketones don't work because they have to have oxygen, and oxygen takes a long time to work. Now, if you look at our different macronutrients and how they're broken down, carbs are 100% anti-ketogenic. If you have carbs, your body will not produce ketones because it has carbs available, and carbs are our preferred source of ATP energy. Fats are the most easily converted into ketones. They're about 90 to 95% ketogenic. The other bit is in the form of glycerol, which you find on triglycerides. So if you have a triglyceride, you have a structure that looks like this. You have a glycerol head and you have 3 fatty acid tails, hence triglyceride. The fatty acid tails make up at about 90 to 95% of a triglyceride. The glycerol is about 5 to 10%. Glycerol can be easily converted into carbs because if you were to cleave off glycerol, you'd be able to use that straight away as a carbohydrate. And then proteins are about a 50-50 split between being ketogenic and anti-ketogenic. Another way to look at this is you have ketogenic and glucogenic proteins. So your amino acids, or some of your amino acids, are going to be able to be turned into ketones. Others are not going to be able to be turned into ketones. Some of them can be turned into both ketones or glucose. Your biggest ketogenic amino acids are going to be your alanine, glycine, glutamine, arginine, glutamate. Those are going to be your big ones that are highly glucogenic. Your ketogenic only ones are only lysine and leucine. So your L amino acids are going to be ketogenic. Then you have some that can do both. Something like your tryptophan, your tyrosine, your phenylalanine, your isoleucine. Those have the potential to be both ketogenic or glucogenic. Now, I'm throwing around this term ketogenic and anti-ketogenic or glucogenic. What does that actually mean? Well, if you are glucogenic, this means that you can be converted into glucose. It also means you can be converted into acetyl-CoA. If you are ketogenic, you can only be converted into acetyl-CoA. So ketogenic amino acids have to go straight into the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. They cannot go back into glycolysis. A glucogenic or an anti-ketogenic amino acid can go back into glycolysis to then be turned into glucose and give us ATP immediately. So that is what is meant by being ketogenic or anti-ketogenic or glucogenic. Now, this shows you here just what our energy sources come from when we are at a very high activity intensity or an exercise intensity. This here is saying what your ATP sources are during a 3-second sprint. So that means all out sprint for at least 3 seconds. The important thing to note is that all of your metabolic systems occur concurrently. However, the amount you get in ATP from each of them varies widely. Your first source here is your intramuscular ATP and your intramuscular phosphocreatine. So number 1 is your ATP PC system. That accounts for nearly 90% of all of the ATP you produce initially. The other two we have are anaerobic glycolysis and aerobic metabolism. So both aerobic glycolysis, beta oxidation, deamination, that accounts for a little over 10%. So the higher the intensity you go, the more you are going to be reliant on your ATP PCR system. Now, that only happens for a very short amount of time. Your ATP PCR system is only going to last you roughly, this is going to last you about 10-ish seconds. And then it completely depletes. So you store ATP, like you have stored energy ready to go, but only about 10 seconds of it. After that first 10 seconds, you have kick-started your anaerobic glycolysis to get going. So you've given it enough time to start up. Anaerobic glycolysis buys you enough time to then switch on aerobic or oxidative phosphorylation or aerobic metabolism, which takes the longest to turn on. Now, if we look at this last slide here, this shows you how our intensity varies with duration. If you notice, anaerobic first starts at about 100% for the first 3 seconds. Aerobic doesn't kick in until a little bit after that. So within the first 10 seconds, you're about 90-10 split between anaerobic and aerobic. Once you go for roughly about 2 to 4 minutes, that's how much time your body needs to get your aerobic system to take over. So once your aerobic system takes over, why would you need your anaerobic system? Well, if you ever need to have any short bursts of energy, you're going to need to rely on the the anaerobic system. It also is going to act almost like a Tesla car. If you ever read about a Tesla car, you know that they have what's known as regenerative braking, meaning that when you brake or when the car slows down, the amount of energy it takes to slow and stop that car gets reconverted into electrical energy that's stored in the battery. So you never have to actually hit the brakes, because when you let your foot off the gas pedal, the car slows and will eventually stop by itself. That's because it has regenerative braking. That means that as you brake, the car generates more energy to use later. So we can use that same thing with anaerobic respiration to kind of store for later. When we get to the end of, say, a long workout or a long event, let's say we're running a marathon, once you get to about that 2-hour mark, you're at virtually 100% aerobic activity or aerobic metabolism. Let's say that last 100 yards, though, of your marathon, you're trying to just dead on sprint. Your aerobic system isn't going to work for that. That's why you have that regenerative braking, where you have that anaerobic system kind of left over to be able to do that for you when you need it. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of a better understanding of what happens when we eat, what happens when we don't eat, and what happens when we exercise at high and low intensities for short or long durations relative to our metabolism. Again, the faster or the higher intensity you go, the more anaerobic your metabolism will be. The lower the intensity and or the longer the duration, the more aerobic it will be. So until next time, I hope you guys have all learned something, and I will see you all later.